Hello, welcome to another edition of Let's Talk Hiring. We're thrilled to be here today with Phil Strazzulla of SelectSoftware. Been in this space a long time. We're excited to learn a ton with him. He's a veteran in the space in hiring and HR technology, and we're excited to dig deep for those that are trying to work through the maze of finding the right solutions for their business. Also, of course, Josh Tolan, who's the CEO of Spark Hire. And I'm Gary Schwake, the Chief Revenue Officer of Spark Hire. All right. So, well, first, before we begin, let's have some comments. Just put in the comments where you're located. We are across the East and Midwest. I'm in Charlotte, North Carolina. Josh is in Chicago, and Phil's in Boston. And we've got others from Colorado, Florida. I know that. Okay. All right. Well, let's dive in here. So first thing, we put up a poll about a week or so ago. Actually, Josh put it up, and we're talking through as a talent acquisition leader, the biggest limitation or frustration as we think about hiring software. And if Patrick, you can go ahead and throw that up on the screen. Love to get some feedback here. So really 5 different things: getting stakeholder buy-in, too many software options, knowing what I actually need, and not enough time to research. So if you take a second and put some comments there. But the poll actually revealed, I guess not surprisingly, that getting stakeholder buy-in was overwhelmingly the top choice. 3/4 of responses were around that. And then also not enough time to research, which is probably a close corollary to that. So I guess, Phil, in your experience, does that surprise you as you think about, people are what they're doing and how they're doing it, especially for those that are, sub 1,000 employees and relatively small, not only recruiting teams, but HR teams as well?
Yeah, and thanks for having me, guys. I'm looking forward to the conversation and sharing stuff that we learned from helping companies find and buy the right software. I'm a bit biased because I think, I'm so focused on the problem set of like, how do you figure out which vendors to talk to? And I think that's why a lot of companies come to us is, there's so many options out there and we're looking for a new HRIS, ATS, whatever, like which ones do I even look at in the first place? And what we find sometimes is, somebody's looking at a performance management system when they're really trying to search for HRIS or something of that effect. But I think, when I see the results, then I get biased again. And I'm like, oh, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And, you just hear this recurring theme over and over again of, hey, I've got a problem. I know I've got a problem. Probably done some research, talked to vendors, done some demos, et cetera. And then all of a sudden, I go to the CFO or I go to, whoever the sort of power up be is, and they're like, you know what, we just can't get that right now. Let's revisit it next quarter, next year, or whatever the case may be. You're probably seeing that even more and more with the sort of macro environment, a lot of uncertainty. I've got a couple of friends who are CFOs and, the personality type is a bit cautious. And I think especially in times where it's like, hey, where are we going? Sort of, are we going to a recession? Or are we going back to growth mode, et cetera? So I think it's not super surprising, especially from like the procurement perspective. And then even I think another kind of important part of stakeholder buy-in is implementation and getting use out of tools as well. And I think that's a lot of times where we see folks stumble is, hey, we bought this thing, but it's not like just your TA team or just your HR team is using this solution. Usually it's a lot of other folks within the organization, and can be hard to evangelize that. And it's sort of an extra burden placed on these TA and HR teams. Whereas, your sales team implements a new CRM, the sales team's using it. They don't have to get the product team to use it or something like that. So seeing that, I guess, it is not crazy surprising after I think about the data a little bit.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because we were just recently at Sherm Talent and we were asking people at the conference what their biggest hiring headache was. And a lot of people were talking about collaboration with hiring managers being the top challenge. And so I wasn't too surprised to see the results of this related to getting stakeholder buy-in. But that was going to be my next question. I was curious for the audience or for the people that responded to the poll was if it's more related to the buy-in to get approval to use the thing. So, finance or execs, or is it buy-in once you've gotten the approval, you've bought the thing, and now it's time to actually use it and adopt it? And I think, Phil, to your point, it's such a cross-functional environment when you're talking about hiring. If you're in sales, you buy a sales tool and really only have to worry about the sales team using it. But when HR or the TA team buys something that's meant for hiring, that spans every hiring manager within the company and every department within the company. So it takes a lot of effort to make sure that people are bought in when it comes to implementation. From your experience, Phil, what do you see teams struggle with more? Is it more on the getting approval side of things, or is it more on the implementation and making sure that what we bought ends up being successful by getting everybody to use it?
I think the more poignant one is the budgeting and getting approval, because I think people, there's hard dollars involved, and people really feel almost like hurt by, hey, I did all this work, we've got the problem, do you just not trust me? Like, what's going on here? Why aren't you giving me the budget? I think in reality, like probably the second problem almost exacerbates the first, where maybe there was a tool bot previously that didn't get the adoption that you needed, and therefore it's harder to get the budget the next time around. We bought a candidate assessment tool, and there's a portion of the universe that's using it. They like it, but we didn't properly evangelize it, train people on it, reinforce why we're doing this. And therefore, when we want to go and get a new ATS, there's some breaks, there's some yellow lights from the CFO's office. There's a tactic that somebody shared with me a couple of years ago that I think can solve actually both of these problems, or at least get you 95% of the way there. And basically, what's interesting about these problems for the organization around hiring is that they don't just impact the TA team, it's the hiring managers, it's the sales teams that aren't hitting quota. And so what I found the most effective leaders in HR or TA do is they say, hey, we've got this problem. We can't hire quota bearing sales reps fast enough, or engineers, or whatever it is for your organization. I'm going to work on this in the next quarter or two. Does anybody else want to help me on this? And you're going to get people that raise their hand from, the sales org, of course, but maybe other orgs that are feeling the pain. And the idea is to have these people almost be like your board of directors throughout this project. So they're not doing the work. They're not, on demos. They're not spending a tremendous amount of time. Maybe you have a monthly or biweekly meeting that's 30 minutes. That's like, hey, here's the progress that we've made. Here are the ideas that we've made, et cetera. And this board of advisors really solves a couple of different problems for you. One, it's diversity of thought. So you're going to get the experience from the director of the SDR team and the VP of product and whoever else, who are really smart people who have probably dealt with problems like this in previous organizations before. So diversity of thought, they're going to help you vet ideas. Then when you go to get the budget, they're going to be able to apply their juice to get it approved, right? So you go to the CFO and say, hey, we need an ATS, it costs X dollars. CFO says no. The director of sales says, well, wait a minute. I'm involved in this, and I've sort of been involved with this for the last 6 weeks as we've evolved this product, and here's why we're doing it. And, you care about me because I'm the one driving all the revenue. So you really need to do this. And same with your other 2 or 3 people who are on this like board of advisors. Then when you implement, you have these functional leaders who are able to help you better understand how to evangelize the product within each of these teams. And so, and also these people who are raising their hands to do extra work, in general, those are like the gunners of the organization, right? Like those are the people who are doing a really good job and are very respected. And so you basically get, the power of their thought and then the power of their internal juice to get it approved. And then
And it looks like Murphy's Law has struck again.
I think he brings up a really good point, though. The thing that I often see teams struggle with is when they approach buying a new tool, they put a lot of emphasis on the tool. And so they go to the stakeholder, such as the CFO, to buy that tool. And all the focus is on, we need an ATS. Or all the focus when it comes to implementation is they go to all the functional leaders like Phil was talking about, and they say, we bought an ATS, and all the emphasis is around the tool. But the reality is the tool isn't the initiative. The tool is just part of the bigger picture of what we're trying to accomplish as an organization. And so I think if you can zoom out, both when you go to get approval for this new tool and when you go to implement this new tool, and really focus on what is the objective we're trying to achieve. And the tool is just one of the 5 things we're deploying in the organization to reach that objective. It becomes much easier for your stakeholders to conceptualize why we need this tool as part of the bigger picture. And I think to Phil's point, if you can get those functional leaders bought into that concept earlier, they can help you get that across the finish line when you need to get approval from the CFO, and then help you, evangelize that in the organization when you actually buy that thing, because it becomes less about, we bought this new ATS, and it becomes more about, we need to hire 20 sales reps in the second half of the year, so we're set up to hit our 2026 target or whatever the business goal is. And I think when you get people to rally around that, that's where you really get that internal buy-in and get people driving the tool across the finish line as part of a bigger package of things you're trying to work on.
Yeah, I like, Phil, where you started with, we have this particular role that is required for us to make business impact, and we're having a hard time filling it, velocity, quality, whatever that core problem is. You've immediately connected it to some business challenge versus some operational headache, like time wasted or lack of efficiency or things like that. And then when you take that approach first and start with the problem, like, we need to solve this problem before it's like, we need to buy this software. You also, I think, get a sense of, like, to the CFO, this is one of many requests that he or she is getting probably on a daily basis, right? For allocation of resources or problems. So it's not that in this case, hiring technology isn't a priority. It's just not the top priority. And so the goal is, like, how do we make it connected to those top business outcomes if we really believe that that's the case? And then it helps hold us accountable then as we start to develop that plan of, okay, if we were to go out and buy this technology, how would this impact our ability to meet that goal and that target? And I think it's a good way to kind of begin with the end in mind.
Yeah, I think everything is sales, and we've all done sales, obviously, as founders, CRO, and it's really about how do you articulate it, to your point, so it's more acute and more important than the other things that are on the CFO's list that day. And if you can do that, you're going to win the budget, win the mind share. And I highly recommend folks to find someone in your organization who's built like a mini ROI model before for something and partner up with them. If you can do it, you've got an MBA or something like that, then that's awesome too. But I find a lot of folks that are in TA and people leader functions, they mainly are focused on sort of the EQ and candidate experience and things like that. They might not be a spreadsheet jockey. Otherwise, they would have ended up in the finance team, and vice versa, right? Finance person probably not going to be a people leader anytime soon. But when you partner up with that person, even just buy them lunch, buy them coffee, buy them a drink, they can help you put together a short model that basically just says, hey, if we're able to find, buy this technology that maybe it makes our recruiters more efficient, maybe it decreases time to fill, maybe it decreases cost to hire, that's going to end up saving the company a lot of money or generating a lot more revenues. And that can be a really valuable weapon in your pitch. What's also really valuable is that 6 to 18 months later, after you implement, you can go back and see what you got right and what you got wrong. It's basically a journal entry to some extent. And that just helps you become a better business leader as you start to think about, how did this actually change time to fill or productivity or whatever those KPIs were for you.
And Josh was going to pivot to, like, let's bring this down a level to a common question, which is around an applicant tracking system. And we can go to that unless you wanted to cover anything more there.
I think the question I had for Phil, or what I was thinking about just now, is we talked about how a lot of times teams have a problem or some objective in mind, but how do they connect that to what to go look for on the market? Like, as we know, there are so many different categories, and then even within each category, it's not apples to apples. So how do you take a problem or something you're trying to achieve in the business from a hiring standpoint and connect that to where should I be looking? Like, Phil, to your point, sometimes you'll be talking to an organization that says, hey, we need a performance management system, and really they need an HRIS, or vice versa. So how do you help them connect the dots?
I think it's hard because everybody has a million things going on, and I don't expect anybody to become like HR tech expert, because it's just foolish. Like, Gary, I'm sure you're not like a CRM expert. Like, you couldn't tell me like everything about every CRM on the market. And if you could, that would be like a red flag, right? It's like, why are you spending all your time doing that? I think that, you can leverage an organization like ours, which is free research, and you can talk to any of our advisors for free as well. And that's always a resource. I think your community, whether that's, your local SHRM chapter or meetup groups you're part of, WhatsApp groups, et cetera, those are great places to say, hey, we're dealing with whatever the problem is. And it could be something that's like a little bit more vague than you're proud of. And sometimes those people can help you drill down into what you're actually potentially looking at. I also honestly think that like something like a ChatGPT can be a decent thought partner on something like this, where you can give it sort of a nebulous problem and use it as a thought partner. It's not going to tell you the answer. It doesn't know. It's never, run a recruiting team, but it has access to a lot of information out there and can probably stimulate some ideas. And so it can be challenging, but I also would not shy away from talking to other business leaders in your organization, because it's like, hey, we're all rowing in the same direction. And the thing I'm trying to deal with is X, Y, and Z. What have you seen from companies that you used to work at, or peer groups that you're a part of? Everybody's networked together and everybody's sharing learnings.
Yep. Makes sense.
Yeah. And so with that in mind, let's just use the applicant tracking system as, the common consideration for many organizations. And I think there's a variety of different ways that they would, organizations are faced with how to make that decision. One is we don't have one, and we've lived perfectly fine without it, right? And for many organizations, you don't know what you don't know, and then a talent leader comes in and it's like, wait, what? Why are we doing it this way? Like, there is a better way to do this. There's building that business case and how to think about it. Then there's, at the other extreme, maybe there's the good enough version, where maybe it's included with whatever, broader HR tech you have that does the job at the beginning, but starts to show strain as you put some more volume against it.
Mm-hmm.
And then of course there are those that are purpose built that maybe were purchased at a time when the business was in a different spot. And, there's those needs as well. So as we think about that landscape of kind of working through that, back to your point of, the capabilities. If I just went out and searched applicant tracking system, right, we'd get a lot of them. And so when you're working with your clients and advising folks in the space, how do you have them like back up and start from the beginning on how to build their requirements for what it is they're trying to solve and what they need to help solve them?
Yep. I think that for sure you want to start with what are the actual problems, versus we don't want to make an assumption that you need any ATS, right? Because again, everybody is so busy with their lives and their professional lives, and very few folks are experts in this ecosystem, and the ecosystem evolves very, very quickly. And so we just want to make sure that, hey, recruiter efficiency is a problem, or, scaling hiring is a problem, or, whatever the case may be that like actually makes us think, hey, we may need a new ATS here. Beyond that, there are considerations that are from all different stakeholders. So you've got sort of the primary TA stakeholders who are looking for what sort of automations are we going to have to gain efficiencies? What sort of work are we going to take off our plate? How do we maybe increase the funnel for sourcing? We're looking at integrations with tools that we already use, whether maybe that's an HRIS and you want to feed into onboarding. Maybe it's different assessment tools or sourcing tools. And then there are other folks in your organization that are important as well. And you might be looking at hiring managers and what they're looking to get out of it. You might be looking at the CFO, info security. So you want to be mindful of those as well as you start to build this requirements list. And then the universe is large, as you point out. And to be honest with you, I don't know of a better way than talking to our advisor team to figure out really what solutions you should look at. There's obviously, you can do internet research, you can ask your community, and those are decent ways of doing it. You can even go on websites like a G2 Crowd that have lots of crowd reviews, but you have only so much time in the day and you want to get to the right decisions. You don't just want to have a list of 12 companies that you have to go do demos of and then stay organized and take notes on and this whole thing. So it is, it's very, very challenging. And to be honest with you, that's why we started our business, is to help people with this problem. But those are sort of the broader frameworks that I would use when starting out.
Yeah. So maybe let's unpack that a little bit. You mentioned the advisory team. So somebody approaches you for the first time. How do you start? Like, how are you helping them frame up the steps to put them in a spot to be successful?
Yeah. So I think there's some broad questions around how big is your company? What integrations do you need? What feature sets are you looking for? Do you want the cheapest option, or do you want a better option that's going to cost more money? Are you looking for an all-in-one solution that maybe is also your HRIS and payroll and everything else, and maybe you're willing to sacrifice functionality to have something that's more simple? These are the sorts of questions that can take that universe of 100 plus vendors and start to chisel it down to maybe 5 or 6 or even 2 or 3, which is really where you want to be, in my opinion. Is you want to be in that 2 to 4 grouping where you can spend a lot of time and do a thorough analysis of each of those and eventually select one.
Yeah, I'm as you say that, I'm imagining, and maybe you already have this, is basically think of it as a spectrum with, maybe it's a 2 or 3D matrix where you're going through those questions and you're lopping off entire, categories or providers of software. Because although my guess is that, just like you said, would you like the simplicity of an all-in-one solution? People say, absolutely. I'm like, it comes at a cost, right? There is these things. So then they start to really, now it becomes less binary and more weighting, right? And I assume then starting to tie those things back to business outcomes. Like, how does your team expose that aspect to it, where you start thinking about, there are lots of problems to solve, but if you solve these 1 or 2, you would actually have the greatest impact on your business?
Yeah. So we actually have a couple of ATS ROI calculators with some spreadsheets and some videos. And again, I always encourage people to find somebody in your organization who you can partner up with on this, who maybe has an MBA, maybe they're on the finance team or they're on the strategy team or something like that. And they've done this sort of, it's not unbelievably complicated, but for some reason it's more intuitive to some people than others to think about, hey, if we decrease time to fill for salespeople by 20%, what is the dollar that comes out of that, right? And you got to multiply how many salespeople are we hiring and what's their quota, and maybe what's the impact to enterprise value if you're a venture-backed or private equity-backed company, or maybe you care about it if you're a publicly traded company too. Yeah, we basically are trying to articulate it on mostly time to hire and efficiency and cost per hire when it comes to applicant tracking systems, and trying to figure out, for some companies, it's like, hey, we're spending a ton of money on third-party recruiters. And for others, it honestly might be something as more nebulous as we're just missing the right people. We're responding too late. We're inundated with resumes. That's something we hear over and over again these days, is we're just getting slammed with all of these applicants. We have no way to sort them and organize them and vet them effectively. So those sorts of things you kind of know in your gut are big problems. And then it's about, how do you think about the sort of business case that you can take to the power be that internal stakeholder, get back to that original polling question, to actually get the budget.
Excellent.
Yeah, it's a really, really good point. How do you think about, Gary mentioned and you mentioned it too, Phil, like the all-in-one solution of an HRIS plus an ATS versus the standalone ATS, especially when it comes to, it sounds like what you were just referencing are organizations where they're looking for their first ATS. So to Gary's point, like somebody could be easily enamored with, yes, of course, why wouldn't I want the all-in-one and everything that comes with it? But it also comes at a cost of, okay, well, now you're thinking about implementing really multiple solutions within one platform. So how do you help organizations vet which direction should I go? Is it better for me to go with the HRS with the simple ATS, or is it better for me to go with a full-on ATS and not worry about the HRIS for right now?
And if I can piggyback on that, especially when typically the HRIS platforms are selected by the CFO, and the CFO sees that their HRIS platform has an ATS and says, well, why don't we just use that? Right? We're already using that platform. And it probably goes back to, well, if you've defined the problem appropriately, then you'll be able to, better articulate what the differences are and the impact it would have to the business.
So one of the biggest mistakes that we see when people buy software is they buy it from an existing vendor because they have a prior relationship. So the canonical example of this would be, we use ADP for payroll. So we're going to buy ADP's HRIS, ATS, et cetera. And that was basically the strategy of a lot of these vendors for a really long time, right? We've got you for something. Through acquisition, we're going to add a product and we're just going to kind of cross-sell it into the base. And I think a lot of these companies got away with it for a very long time, even though those products were pretty subpar. And now the tide has turned, I believe. The reputation of a lot of those companies is damaged pretty much, for good, I would say, unless something crazy happens. And so a lot of companies that come to us, a lot of HR teams, probably like 60+% of them are moving off some sort of legacy system where they had, one of the kind of core 5 or 6 vendors, legacy vendors, and they bought too much random stuff from them and they regretted it because it's just not very good software. Everybody, the 3 of us plus anybody listening has used software before and knows that the devil is in the details. And you can check the box and say, yeah, we take in applicants and there's a database and you can leave feedback on them and, collaboratively recruit and all this stuff. And it's like, all right, check the box. Like that's an applicant tracking system. But the reality is at a lot of these all-in-one vendors, there's like a product manager who is drastically under-resourced versus a point solution. And also probably is not like as economically incentivized as an entrepreneur to build the best-in-class solution for a given problem. So if you want an applicant tracking system that is just going to be like good enough, then yeah, you should do your all-in-one because it's going to be simpler, it's probably going to be cheaper, and it perfectly integrates with the rest of your HR tech stack. But if you need all of these like idiosyncratic aspects, if you want, really good automations, if you want a really good career site and candidate nurturing and, lots of different complicated workflows for different types of candidates and, a really robust integrations network, like all the stuff that a best-in-class solution would have, then you got to go out and buy one of those. And so it's really just thinking about those trade-offs. But Gary, to your point, if the problem is, we can't hire the right people, our recruiting teams are not very efficient, then you've answered your question for yourself, right? You know what you need to do. You need to go out and buy an ATS.
Yep. This is kind of a tangent, but related to that, as people are considering maybe as the first step that, maybe that does make the most sense is we're familiar with this vendor. We already have a relationship. Either we, regardless of how we were doing it before, that we don't have an ATS or we're changing an ATS and they move over to the ATS from their HRIS platform. any advice you would give on how they might want to structure the contract to maintain optionality? I don't want to get into detail. And what I mean by that is, like, the tendency will be to just bucket it all in together, right? And it looks great on the surface, but then you realize what you're giving up is flexibility and optionality to be able to, make those adjustments. Is that something you've helped with your clients?
We usually don't go as deep as contract negotiation, but what I think is really interesting is that, you have a lot more leverage as a buyer these days than you probably ever have, just because the state of the market. And if you don't feel comfortable pushing hard, then get your CFO to do it. And you should have the ability, if you're contemplating, look, like, we're going to buy Rippling or Bamboo or something like that has an applicant tracking system in it, but the back of my mind, I'm super stressed because I'm pretty sure we're going to need something else, then you definitely need that in the contract, and they're going to allow you to put it in there because they want your business, right? And so you can lower that PEPM cost pretty substantially by not having one of these modules. And after you're in the system for a few months, you're going to know for sure if you need another system or not. So try to preserve that optionality as much as you can. I think in general, that's a good rule, especially where these systems are evolving so quickly.
Right.
Phil, you also, sorry,
Go ahead,
Terry, one thing. Phil, you also mentioned, when you're helping an organization determine if they need to buy, a best in breed ATS versus using an HRS, you started mentioning and ripping off some different features and functionality that some ATSs have. I want to touch on that from the standpoint of, I think a lot of teams fall in that trap of having a list of features that they're looking for. And then when they go out into the market and talk to different vendors, a lot of the vendors are going to be able to check the box or say yes to the question when they ask the binary, do you have this feature or not? And that's how a lot of teams approach their evaluation. And the reality is, different providers solve problems in different ways. And so one might not have the feature that you're looking for, but they still solve the problem just in a different way and maybe better. So how do you help, your clients have that perspective when they go into an evaluation so they don't fall into the, the cross-section feature comparison chart where they're just looking for yes, no answers, and that's how they ultimately make a decision?
It's a great question. And this is, my favorite example of this is the feature of, do you have a mobile app? And a lot of, I think probably best in class vendors will say, no, we have a mobile first web experience, right? Like, we don't want your team to have to download a new app to use our solution. And so that's like a no, right? It's like, no, you don't have a mobile app. But the reality is, we have something better than a mobile app, right? So what's interesting on the enterprise side is, I think this is why a company like Workday has done so well, is they basically check all the boxes. And so when you run an RFP, which is how these things are done mostly for big companies, you're checking of the 100 boxes, they check off 95 of them. But if you look at, ask anybody if they like Workday and, go on Reddit, and it's like page after page of people being like, this is the worst software I've ever used. It's gotten better in the last few years, but pretty rough for a while. And it's a $100 billion publicly traded company or something like that. So they've done quite well selling the software, I think, because of this like checklist problem. And the person who pays the price is the user, whether that's a recruiter or an employee or a candidate. So what we would recommend is build out your requirements list. And there's probably like 5 or 6 like stuff we need to have, like maybe there's like a really important integration. Maybe we're really jazzed about like having an amazing career website, or we have a very specific talent demographic that, we need SMS, like we need to have like some specific like SMS workflow or integrations with certain job boards, et cetera. After that, there's another, bunch of stuff that's like nice to haves or somewhat important. And instead of just putting an X or a check mark in each of these, you do want to have the context around, what does the integration mean? Because integration could mean, you got to download a CSV and upload it back into a system. And that's obviously a much different scenario than something that's natively built through an API, or even something that's facilitated through a Zapier or something like that. So I think those are really important criteria, and it's important to have that context. It's important to stay organized. I think the vast majority of people who buy software are not organized, and these demos tend to bleed into each other, and you're like, which one was that? And I think the kind of like hidden criteria for some of these buying processes is, how much do you like your sales rep? And I think why this is an important criteria is that really good salespeople can basically work anywhere. They just show up to a company and say, hey, here's my comp plan last year, and here's my number. And so you're like, oh, okay, great. You crush your quota, your president's club, you're hired, right? And so that person who's organized, who's empathetic, who knows the industry, who can understand your business, if that person's working in a company that they can hit their quota, hit their number, and make a lot of money. And that correlates really strongly with a product and onboarding and customer success that they can stand behind. Because if they don't have a good product, that means that they can't hit their number. And so they're going to go on to the next company. And so when you're talking to 3 or 4 companies, something to keep in mind that you're probably doing at a subconscious level anyways, because that's just how humans are. But something to even put in that spreadsheet is just, how much did you like your rep? Because the best reps tend to flock to really, really good companies that are supported by good products.
That's a really good point. And you know, having been a seller for a very long time, you know, the people that really are enabling the buyer to buy and empathetic and, you know, understand what you're trying to go and actually help you be a better buyer in the process are a good indication of, you know, what kind of company you're going to end up be partnering with.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting, and maybe a different way for folks to think about this as I'm hearing you describe how somebody should set up their vendor selection or evaluation process. It's not too different than what they're doing from an interview process standpoint, right? When you have a new rec and you're thinking about the requirements, like the classic mistake is you get a laundry list of things from a hiring manager, and here's all the things we're looking for in a candidate, and then shocker, you can't find that person. And so I think it's about being very concise and clear about what you're looking for. The same goes for when you're looking for software. And so if HR teams take that same approach, which they're already doing for the most part in the hiring process, and bring that to the software evaluation process, they'll probably have much more success. One thing I also want to ask about is, and it's kind of related to checking the box. If we go up a level and we think about, and Gary mentioned this a little bit earlier, if we think about the CFO, to them, checking the box could be a whole product. Like, okay, we bought this payroll software and they have an ATS, check the box. This is going to be our ATS. Mm-hmm. How does somebody on the talent or HR team navigate that conversation? So one, when, you know, we were just talking about optionality and structuring a contract, we don't get locked into something that we're stuck with years down the road. How do they navigate that conversation with the financial stakeholder to either A, maintain optionality, or B, you know, help them understand right away why we can't use the check the box ATS that comes with this software, and we have to go out and find something else?
I think it's about empathetically educating them on the differences. And so that entails understanding what that offering is that your colleague is signed up for or is thinking about signing up for, and how you would use it and what the limitations are relative to the other options out there. So it's like, hey, you know, this career site isn't mobile friendly, and 40% of our traffic is mobile. And so like, are we going to lose like a huge percentage of our applicants? And therefore we have to rely on third-party recruiters more often. Our whole hiring process is built around this candidate assessment tool that doesn't have an integration with this. And so we're going to spend 20 hours a week, you know, kind of bouncing back and forth between and moving profiles and things like that, versus, you know, using this other solution. And maybe, you know, the cost is more, but if we're saving 20 hours a week of manpower, then that probably the cost is very justified very quickly. So it's really, it just comes down to understanding, like, what does the CFO care about? What are the things that move the needle for them? And then how do you build that business case? And part of that is a spreadsheet, and part of that is just explaining the workflows and the differences, because at the end of the day, they care about cost, but they care about the overall financial health of the business. And so if that means that we don't have to, hire another recruiting coordinator or whatever the case may be, then that's going to be a yes. But you've got to explain it to them.
Related, circling back to what we talked about actually a little bit earlier, related to financial health and the CFO's perspective, is this idea of, like, we've been burned before about software that we purchased and then, failed on, just, dead on arrival. As part of the search and selection process, are you helping them also think about what they need to do to be ready to actually take value in that? Like, look, if we're going to take this step, it's one thing to select the right tool. And part of that is you objectively assessing your own capabilities to implement this tool. And in theory, that should be part of the selection process, is which, ease of use or the support I'm going to get or what have you. But there's still some requirement on our part to make sure that if it's hiring manager engagement or integrations or whatever the case may be, is that part of your rubric for helping them assess success with a tool as well?
I think our advice is always, one, what's nice is we have a lot of information about what are the tools that people are successful with. And so, of all the HRISs in the world, there's a small number that we're actually, like, pretty actively referring people to. There's probably, a dozen or so that get 70% of referrals, because it's like, for this sort of thing, we know these are the ones. And sometimes we have folks that they fumble the ball, and we need to understand what happened there and why, and maybe take a pause on sending folks their way, because they might have a great solution, but some of these companies just grow too fast and they get disorganized. There's too many management changes. A company that goes from 0 to $1 billion of ARR in 10 years, that's a lot of change. And so there can be a lot of mess ups there. Our advice really is, you pick the right vendor, and then you kind of do what they say, because that account manager, they're getting comped probably based on, are you successful, and are you a churn next year, or are you retained? And so they probably care more about you being successful than you do. And they know all the tips and tricks and everything else. And I think where these things go off the rails usually is somebody gets behind on their implementation plan. It's easy to get busy with other stuff. And so, you're not following the playbook, and that's where things typically go wrong for companies.
Yeah, that's a great point. Great point. And as we think about that, I actually want to go back to the kind of the selection process and thinking about features. Let's talk about AI. Obviously, there's a lot of noise around that, but probably I think that's, if there's any area that's really difficult to discern, what do I need, what do I not need, what's hype, what's not hype, is largely because we're all learning it, ourselves, and how it impacts on our business. I'm sure that that's been a big topic of conversation as you think about capabilities, as you're talking to folks. How have you kind of framed this for them, as so help them think about, like, what is actionable and what is something to keep on the horizon and noted of, but is actually going to impact your decision?
I think what's exciting about this shift is it's happening in real time at a pace that's, like, just kind of insane. And we're all starting to use tools like ChatGPT to be a thought partner or content creator or a data analyzer. And now we're starting to see it pop up in some of these tools. And what's interesting is sometimes you use a tool and there's a very clear AI use case, and there's no module to actually execute on it. And I found myself become very frustrated because it's sort of like, why does this not work this way? It's sort of like back in the day, maybe you're shopping for something on the internet and you had to do like a 12-step checkout, or you were applying for a job 10 years ago and you had to fill out, the Taleo, let's put your entire resume into this like structured form. And it's like, why? Like, this is so annoying. And I think, we're starting to, because in sort of our intuition around what these things can do is being built. And we're starting to realize in these solutions, like, hey, why doesn't XYZ have it? The thing is, like, when you buy a solution, you should really be thinking about it. I'm going to use this for 3+ years, and probably more than that, probably more like 5 to 7, and maybe even more longer than that. And so my advice to folks would really be to understand what are the first couple of things that this vendor has built using these technologies for the end user, maybe not their internal tools, but can I, query some information through a natural language format, or, whatever the case may be. And then understand, what is their philosophy? So are they, more like, hey, this is interesting, we're not quite there yet, we're going to think about this next year. Or are they like, we're building quickly, we're all in on this technology, here's the roadmap, here's the thought leadership that we're putting out around AI, and here's how it's actually manifesting in the product thus far. I think you just want to, you're going to have to make a bet on what's coming in the future, because this stuff is evolving so quickly. I mean, the voice models, 5 months ago, there was like a 2-second latency in the voice models, and now it's a 0-second latency. It's real-time communication, right? And so, like, that's how fast these things, and something like that makes the universe much bigger for how these products will be implemented. So I think it's really about philosophy and where the puck's going with the vendor, and sniffing that out through what they're putting out in terms of content and the products that they've built thus far.
That's a really, really good point. Yeah, because you're right. Because the reality is that the sands are shifting faster than ever, and so nobody's got it figured out, and we're all, both as users and as builders, working through what is the best way to do this and creating new ways to solve problems. And it's a new paradigm shift. So to think that you're going to, have everything that you need, it's really more about investing with a partner, right? That's like, let's get some early indications of where they stand and how they view AI. Is that consistent with not just our own departmental philosophy, but the other side of this is that even organizations are really thinking about, what is our AI policy? And that continues to evolve, right? And so a lot of times they're coming in to buy software, I'm like, it's got all this great AI stuff. And then they go to get it approved and security's like, that's not happening. So, having a feel for where your organization is in terms of adoption of AI, I think is an important part of that equation as well.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I was at Transform a month ago, and there were a couple of AI governance companies there that are basically, looking at vendors' AI to understand where it's biased, especially in hiring, especially in HR, compliant, et cetera. And the interesting thing is, just because something is compliant today doesn't mean it's going to be compliant tomorrow. And so that's going to be pretty important part of procurement, I think, over time, especially as we start to see some horror stories come out, which I'm sure we will.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's, to your point, Gary, the key is, how can you see the early indicators that a vendor is committed to AI in their roadmap? But at the same time, I think it's very important to not get caught up in the hype where, a vendor is now committed 100% of their roadmap to AI features, and now they are treating every problem as a nail, with AI being the hammer. And it's like, now everything is just committed to AI. And they're not really talking to customers enough about what are the real problems that need to be solved on a day-to-day basis. Mm-hmm. And in some cases, there will be AI functionality that is a great solution to that problem. And in other cases, there's a different way to solve that same problem. And so I think it's certainly going to be a challenge for people that are looking for software, because everybody's kind of figuring this out. And things are moving so fast. And, whether it's with the technology or whether it's with compliance, everything is changing, it seems like almost daily or weekly at this point. So there's a lot to navigate. So I think it's about like, what are the questions you can ask to get the early indicators that a vendor is committed to AI in their roadmap, but they're not over indexing on it to try and use it to solve everything. And to Phil's point, maybe that's about asking for documentation on their philosophy or their principles, or how they're looking at AI in the next 6 to 12 months of their product. And I think if you can get really clear and concise answers in a format that it's clear the company has documented these things internally, that tells you they're focused on it. It's not like something that, okay, like this customer's asking about it, let's just make something up and send it over to them. When a company has process and assets built around this, there's some level of commitment towards it in the future of the product. And that's at least, speaking from a HR tech CEO side of things.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it'll be fascinating to see how it all evolves, especially in our space, where I think it's going to be really accurate. Like you can't, in large part, like you can't be like 99% accurate, I think, for a lot of these cases.
Yep. I also think, we've, as a vendor, like we've been talking about AI and the use of AI for years now. I think the thing that also has to be balanced with all of this is the candidate side as well. Like I think vendors, again, can very quickly over-index on the implementation of AI and software, but they don't think about the ramifications on the candidate experience or even just candidate sentiment. And so I think that's a really delicate line and something to balance as you think about what you're going to implement in your product. Like, yeah, that might be so cool and innovative and recruiters are going to love it. But if candidates hate it, and a lot of a customer's or an organization's success is dependent on their candidates' success in the hiring process, you can actually create real problems for yourself as a vendor, but also, for customers and organizations that are using it. If that's not at the forefront of how you're thinking about AI in your product roadmap.
Yeah, a good example of that is, so we have, I don't even know how many people a day ask us for HR software help. And a lot of people are booking times with our advisors, and we can't keep up with the call volume. It's just really hard. And so we built this little like AI schedule caller thing that, like, if you fill out the form to talk to one of our advisors, it calls you up to schedule an appointment. And it sounds great. Like it can deal with like really complex questions. Like you can be like, who's Phil Strazzulla? And it'll like tell you who I am. And like, what, like, how do you guys get paid? And like all these like random things. And we were like, this is amazing. And at the end of the day, it sounds 99% human. You can tell it's a bot. And so people are totally fine, like hanging up on it, swearing at it. Like because all these calls are recorded, right? So like, there's all sorts of random conversations that people have had with this bot, and we're going to shut it down today, actually, because it's just like, it's not a great look from a brand perspective. And even if it takes us an extra, day or something to follow up with somebody, it's better to have a person call that person up than an AI, at least at this point. Maybe that'll change in 6 months or 2 years or whatever it is, but at the end of the day, it probably won't, because we're always going to know that's not a person. And, if you're applying for many of these jobs, like people have egos, right? We get insulted and norms change. But I remember like when Calendly came out, and people would get like so mad if you send them a Calendly link. And I saw this on Facebook, on LinkedIn, people posting like, can you believe this? Blah, blah, blah. And it's like, it's more efficient, right? Like it's better than a back and forth, and you give me times and then I get back to you and those times are changed and whatever, but we're all people. And that's the important thing to keep in focus at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's like full circle, right? Let's remember what we're trying to do here, which is to hire great people into the organization. Yeah. That's the goal. And obviously to drive business impact, but to fit the culture and, be additive to the community and all those other things too. So, well, we're reaching the top of the hour here, Phil. This was just unbelievably helpful. I can't thank you enough. I think, your willingness to dig in was really helpful. I think some great insights here that we'll pull together and summarize for the group. Josh, I know I could go for another hour with a bunch of questions, but certainly pop it over to you to add some comments or additional questions for Phil.
Yeah, no, Phil, thank you. Phil and I go way back. So I always know when Phil's joining something, it's going to be good and full of insights. And that's why I love having him on and collaborating with him on all this stuff. So Phil, appreciate the time and great to see you as always.
Thank you guys. Yeah, likewise. Thanks for having me.
Enjoy spring in Boston.
Sounds good.
All right, well, hold back for a minute, and we'll wrap up the live stream here. Thanks again for joining another episode of Let's Talk Hiring, and we'll see you in about 3 weeks. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.